Hello and welcome to the Old Garage number 23. I'm Wild Bill, and we have some questions, we have some silliness, and of course a shout out. So let's get to the questions. First one is from Gabriel F. regarding the special on gasoline, in which he asks, I was thinking about transmissions recently. Could you have a transmission with, for example, 3 output shafts with different ratios, each connected to a clutch that connects to the drive wheels? Seems simple enough to me. Did anyone try something like this? Not with cars. It was done for certain commercial and agricultural applications. For example, International Harvester did have, as well as Case for that matter, did make machines that had transmissions like this to operate different other ancillary pieces of equipment off of the same power source. But it wasn't really necessary when it came to cars, and so it wasn't done for vehicles during that time. But it was done. I mean, the idea of a triple output transmission, dates back to the 1910s. So yes, it was done, just not on cars. Now, some questions from the episode on diesel, Rudolf Diesel, that happened a while back. First one's from Darren Henry, and he asks, did Rudolf Diesel ever power a refrigeration unit with a self-named engine? Yes. It was the company he was working for, Linde, out of Berlin, did make refrigeration units that were powered by diesel engines. And they were not necessarily called a diesel refrigeration. They were still Linde, but it was definitely refrigeration units powered by diesel's engines. So yes, it absolutely was done. Now, I also have a question from Eduardo Espinoza, and he asks, is peanut oil kerosene? The answer is no. Peanut oil is peanut oil. It is derived from peanuts. Interestingly enough, turpentine is also not a petrochemical type of fluid. It's also it's plant derived as well. But no, peanut oil is derived from peanuts. Kerosene is derived from crude oil or coal. So no, peanut oil is not kerosene. Now, from the same episode, Craig Hagenbrook, he asks, talking about both diesel and petrol-powered cars, how did gas and diesel tanks come to be, and were they fueled up on the same side and way as it's done today? Anytime you have a vehicle that requires some sort of liquid fuel, you're going to have a tank, and so gas tanks, diesel tanks, petrol tanks, whatever, have been part of cars since the very beginning. Unless you had, an old De Dion Bouton that was using coal or wood, there was a tank involved. Now, where the fill pipe is not a consistent thing. You have sometimes on the side, sometimes off the top of the tank. I've even seen some coach-built cars where the fill pipe's actually behind the back seat inside the car. So that whether they're on the side or not is not a consistent thing. You have cars, I remember as a kid, having to fill the car by flipping down the license plate, and the fill tank's actually right there behind it. So there's a lot of different ways that was done. So as far as the fill pipes go, they could have been anywhere, from the front of the dashboard to the back of the car to behind one of the lights, behind the license plate, inside the car. It's all over the place. But the idea of having a tank, though, is consistent. If you have a liquid fuel, you need a tank to hold it, and that's been part of cars since the very beginning. So, okay, then I have another question. This is from James MacArthur, again from the episode on diesel. It says, interesting that diesel is named after one particular person, Rudolf. Now I wonder how we got the name of gasoline and or petrol. Okay, well, the gasoline one, according to the legend, was because of a guy back in the 1860s named in England and named John Castle, and he had named his excellent cleaning agent gasoline, and apparently someone in Ireland started doing the same thing, and then he complained to that merchant, and so they just changed the C to a G to gasoline, and it kind of stuck. As far as I know, that's where the actual term gasoline comes from. Now, petrol actually is the Latin for rock oil, and so that's where petrol comes from, or petroleum. And so that's, as far as I know, that's how those names came to be. Wee! Okay, now on the episode from John Marston, we had this question from Gabriel F. It says, how would people in 1910 think about a much later terrible car? Let's say an East German Trabant. Would they see it as just the greatest car ever, or still as subpar in a lot of ways? I've actually thought about that a bit, driving, my old piece of junk that I drive every day. And, what would someone back in the day think of that car? And whether it's a Trabant or a Yugo or a Pinto or whatever you think of as a bad car, well, I can't really say Pintos are necessarily bad, but, they would have to reverse engineer it, really, at that point, and take a look at, okay, not only how did these people, in the future build this car, but the materials to build it. Because keep in mind, 1910, you didn't have plastics, not even Bakelite at that time. And so I don't think that they would be as astonished at how the engine worked, but rather how the materials came to be. What is this stuff? How do we make this? How did they make this? And so I think they would be actually more astonished at what the car's made of than how well the car worked or didn't work. If you were to take, say a Trabant, back, 70, 80 years and let them look at it, they would certainly think it was amazing, okay? But I don't think in its basic principles of operation that they would have learned anything necessarily about it and about cars from it, because even the Trabant is, and the Yugo is an example, which is basically nothing more than a toned down Fiat, was extraordinary, except in its construction, in what they used to actually put the thing together. That is where they would have really had a wide eye opener, going, wow, how did they do this? But as far as the car's capabilities, I mean, by 1910, there were already, makes of cars out there that were just as well performing, if not better, than those cars from the 80s and 90s. So I think they would have gone, okay, this is great, but how did they build this, and what were the construction techniques involved in the materials used? I think that's what they would have freaked out about. Okay, now got a question from the episode on Thomas White, another one from Gabriel F., and he says, as a lot of early automotive geniuses seem to come from making sewing machines or bicycles, were there any other common industries that translated into lots of automotive pioneers that I'm not thinking of? Oh, yeah, there were. First of all, you have a lot of folks that came from electrical engineering. You have James Packard. You have Henry Royce, electrical engineers. You have gun makers like Henry Leland, manufacturing firearms. Pretty much any company in the turn of the 20th century, or anybody that was involved in a company that was doing some sort of manufacturing, had the opportunity and often did get into making cars. There was a lot of different industries that did, and just run through the channel. You'll see the backgrounds of a lot of them. So yeah, there was a bunch. And boy, Gabriel F. asked a lot in this last round. And so he also asked, and again, this is from the Thomas White episode. He says, I forgot if this has been asked, but what's the early history of turn signals? I can hardly imagine a Cadillac or Cord or Duesenberg driver waving their hand out the window. Were traffic gators ever popular in the U.S.? Actually, I think I did address this briefly, and who knows, maybe I'll do an episode about it. Or maybe not, I don't know, because turn indicators didn't become a thing until the late 1930s, and they weren't even mandated by various countries' transportation, laws until the 40s and 50s. But prior to World War I, there were no indicators at all. There were no, a trafficator might be there, but again, it was rare. And the thing was is that a lot of these early cars didn't have electric lighting. Their lights were operated off of acetylene or kerosene or lamp oil or something like that, or in some cases even candles. And so having a turn signal, through a light wasn't really thinkable. As far as the, sticking your arm out and going left, right, and stop, etc. Again, that's not something that came about until, as far as mandates go, until the 1930s. And even that wasn't universal. It wasn't every country. It kind of slowly happened until you get to the 1950s when cars were finally required to have electric turn signals. Now, trafficators do exist, prior to World War I. Mostly in your coach builds, and also after World War I and through to the 1920s and 30s and even 40s. They lasted longer on European cars than they did in American cars. And of course, a trafficator is basically an arm that would come out from the side of the car to indicate whether you were turning left, turning right, or whatever. But yeah, they did exist. But as far as turn indicators and such, that's fairly late in traffic history that those started coming out. Okay, and also from that episode, I have a question from James MacArthur, and he asks, "Now I'm curious," and this is again about Thomas White. He says, "I'm curious what happened to White to take them from the largest producer of vehicles in the world to a footnote in history." Well, the answer is simple: they stopped making cars. By World War I, they had already moved most of their production into making heavy trucks, and then during World War I, they became quite a large contractor for the U.S. government, for the Defense Department, making various vehicles and machines and engines and such. And after that war, they really focused on just making commercial trucks and construction vehicles and also military vehicles, and continued to be one of the United States' largest defense contractors through to the 1980s. White was huge. I mean, it wasn't that they stopped being a big company. They just stopped making cars, and so if you stop making cars, you're no longer a big car manufacturer. Kind of makes sense. Okay, and those were the questions that we had this time around. But I do have some silliness, and we still have a shout out to go with. So with the silliness, I was thinking, you know what? We have a lot of different makes of vintage cars from all over the world that we've talked about in Europe, in Americas, and elsewhere. And many of these countries, you don't necessarily think of as making vintage cars, but actually made quite a few. Australia and Canada and Belgium and countries like that. So what about some cars vintage cars that came from some unexpected places? And I went the top 5 you would not expect a vintage car to come from this country. And number 5, I picked Argentina. There was a car made, the Anasagati, from 1912 in Argentina. And they made cars in Argentina in 1912. Now, those fans of classical music will probably love the music of Sibelius when he wrote Finlandia. I happen to like that piece. And in my number 4 spot is Finland, because they did build the Finlandia. And now this was in 1923, so a little after World War I, but nonetheless, Finland did make a vintage car. And the Soviet Union is not known for vintage cars. However, Russia, Imperial Russia, the Russo-Baltique was built in Moscow in 1905 and is Russia's claim to veteran and vintage cars. And my number 2 spot is Norway, who did build the Norsk in 1907. And again, you don't think of Norway when you think of vintage cars, but yes, They didn't have one, the Norsk. And then my number one, I actually did an episode on these, is Mexico, and that's the Muller and the Grace, which was being built in 1898 out in Mexico City. So yeah, there's 5 of them: Argentina, Finland, Russia, Norway, and Mexico. So 5 places that really did make vintage cars. Now, shout out. Got a great one for you today. Out in California, there's this guy, Randy Carlson, and he runs a YouTube channel called Carchaeology. Instead of archaeology, Carchaeology. Gotta love it. And he finds cars from barns and fields and dusty garages everywhere and brings them back to life. You've got to check out this channel. I especially like, right now, he's doing a series on a 1940 Mercedes-Benz C320 that he's found. A one-of-a-kind bodied car. You'll have to go check out his channel to find more about it. But he does a lot more than that. He goes on a lot of different road trips, shows you all kinds of cars, and of course he has his laboratory, his lab, where he will go through and get these cars back alive and get them back on the road. So, Carchaeology, check it out. Really a great channel. And that's what we had today for the Old Garage. So, we'll see you next time. Peace.